Hello and welcome to the Efficio podcast. This is our third podcast in our series looking at the impacts of the COVID crisis on procurement and supply chain. And our attention today focuses on logistics as a category, which is, I'm sure, one we can all appreciate has been significantly affected by this crisis and myriad of complex issues that it's thrown up. So I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleague, Chris Clapham. Chris, could you introduce yourself?
Yep, so my name's Chris Clapham. I'm a principal at Efficio. I've been with Efficio for 10 years and I head up the logistics SME community.
Fantastic. So thanks, Chris. So as I said, I guess we're all now working from home and isolated and probably getting more and more stuff delivered to our door and to our homes. So I'm sure we can all appreciate logistics has been changed. But what are you seeing as the impact of COVID on that category and this topic?
I think firstly, logistics service providers, obviously there's a huge labour impact or huge labour element within these services, so which has been impacted obviously by the social distancing measures and the restrictions and so on that have been put in place. On top of that, obviously there's been, publicly and in the news mentioned a lot is around large volatility of demand across industries. So through panic buying, as we've seen in kind of the supermarkets, which is obviously putting additional pressure onto the logistics service companies, obviously with their reduced labour forces as well, as mentioned a minute ago. And then on top of that as well, as we're seeing kind of countries change their restrictions, we're also then seeing border controls tightening up, slowing down shipments as well, especially obviously in international services across most of the regions. So that is another element impacting on kind of logistics and supply chains. And trying to look at a couple of different elements of logistics, obviously we've got different types of transport modes. So looking at the transatlantic lane, for example, actually 80% of that is typically made up of passenger aircraft, which largely are now grounded. So there is a huge shortage of capacity in some areas as well, such as air freight, which is again putting additional pressures on the whole supply chain. Obviously, some of those are being mitigated by charter planes being used, and also passenger airlines are now looking to actually still fly some of their planes for cargo purposes. So obviously what we've seen mainly across the market is definitely market price impacts, just given the shortage of supply and obviously still a lot of demand for certain industries is driving a lot of those prices up. But I think on a positive note, there is still capacity within the market. So there are still suppliers out there, and obviously different suppliers, depending on what their client base is, typically have been affected in different ways. And then some of those, if they are in retail, for example, let's say fashion retail, then they will actually see those volumes come down. So they actually have, let's say, more surplus capacity. So although it sounds all doom and gloom, there are actually opportunities out there as well.
Fantastic. And so for our colleagues in the procurement community who are, grappling with all of those different challenges and levers that you mentioned there, are there any kind of tips or tricks or things that you would suggest people think about for this category?
Yeah, definitely. I think first and foremost, what is absolutely key is having kind of close communication with their clients and actually understanding what the latest needs are. We're seeing so much change on almost a daily basis. So having that communication and also visibility across the supply chain of where your shipments are and kind of all the pieces coming together, that's an absolutely key bit. But yeah, with those restrictions changing, that can mean customers' requirements are changing, which mean that you may actually not need a shipment at all and therefore not a demand for that logistics service, or also opening up options around flexibility, which I'll come to in a minute as to how those can then be looked into as well. Given obviously the changes in volumes, there are also opportunities to review the network design and remove some steps of the supply chain potentially. So, where volumes have come down, you may now not need to use a kind of hub and spoke network. You may be able to actually just deliver those directly from a national distribution center, for example. So there's some kind of demand side things to look at firstly. Then kind of going the next step down, once you kind of got your, let's say, shipment requirements, I would suggest segmenting those across a couple of different buckets. So one, you may have critical shipments that just need to go, and they need to go as quickly as possible, and kind of no matter what, those will continue. So there, I think, again, a close communication with any key partners that you're already working with. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other players within the market who have capacity. So it's worth just reaching out to the wider market and understanding what capacity and solutions may be out there. As I mentioned a minute ago, I know of some providers, for example, who have been in the retail sector who have seen those volumes come down in those particular parts of their business, and therefore they have that capacity that they could pick up. So it's kind of finding those kind of players within the market who can fulfill those needs and find you the best solution there for hopefully also at a competitive rate at the end of the day. Then kind of the second bucket would be shipments that you potentially slow down. And this is what I was referring to a bit earlier in terms of potential flexibility with customers' needs and requirements. There are obviously alternative solutions. So if I typically would send something by air freight, for example, I could move that to ocean freight, which obviously would be a slower service, but there is, to some extent, more capacities there. There are also some other interesting solutions that different providers will offer, even in kind of the courier parcel side of things as well, to kind of fulfill some of those solutions. So, and this is obviously constantly moving, and there's more and more solutions being set up and created at the moment to fulfill that need. And then, the kind of last bucket is kind of what I touched upon a little bit earlier, but are there any kind of shipments that could be stopped altogether, which links into if there's certain customers that maybe are being affected by restrictions. Obviously, we're seeing in the case of kind of Italy and Spain, full kind of shutdowns. There could be other countries that come on to that. So stopping those shipments altogether, obviously, and being able to do that quickly and react quickly is an absolute key element, as well as any kind of, let's say, non-urgent or non-high priority shipments that maybe could be stopped altogether is something else to look at.
I guess clearly this is a kind of seismic impact on logistics and the industry generally. Do you see any changes as we come out of the other side of this? Any kind of positive benefits that might be coming?
Yeah, I think potentially quite a few, actually. I think firstly, obviously, we've seen the kind of firsthand the challenges of actually also having a just-in-time supply chain, as some industries have. The retail supermarket kind of being part of that. And one of the challenges of that is obviously when there is this volatility of demand, that they aren't able to cope as quickly when we're seeing the empty shelves. So I think after this, a lot of companies will also really give more weighting to or consider also how do we make sure our supply chains are flexible and scalable, let's say more easily. And also kind of the real importance of business continuity plans is really being highlighted as well. So I think people will be better prepared and businesses will be better prepared in the future for any future volatility situations. Hopefully not as bad as this, but even smaller cases. I think another thing is we're also seeing quite a bit of innovation of different solutions coming out. I mentioned earlier around the kind of passenger airlines looking to do some cargo, and people are looking into that in terms of how can they actually make sure they're utilizing as much of that space as possible. And so I think out of this, there will be some new innovations, some new flexible solutions that hopefully will come out of this, which obviously would have a lasting impact on the industry. And finally, one of the things kind of more as a side note is in terms of we've seen the impact of the environment and kind of driving less and utilizing less fossil fuels. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if there is another kind of further shift and push on, environmental impact out of this. We've seen what positive effects that has had on the world, clearer waters and better air quality. So I think that could well be again another push at the end of this as well, where we might see significant changes.
Chris, thank you so much. That has been fascinating and really interesting to hear the issues, but also potentially talk about some of the positives that may come from this. So thank you so much. For those listening, if you have any questions on anything we discussed today, please let either myself or Chris know via the usual channels on LinkedIn, etc. But Chris, thank you for your time. Really much appreciated. And for those people listening, thank you. And we will be publishing our next podcast about our next category in due course. So thank you very much.